5:05. Time to get it rolling. Please let me know if the microphone is too low or too loud or just right. Always hard to tell with these little meters in the streaming software, so sounds right. That sounds good. All right. Yeah, so it's been a while since the last stream. Nice to see you all again. Yeah, we've been doing a lot of things since Chiral. All of these little devices we're gonna get into in a sec. Kind of go through all of them and show all the features, all the ideas behind, and kind of some tips and tricks. And besides doing these devices in the kit, we've been working on the Osiris Eurorack module together with Modbap Modular, which has been a really cool project. It's going to be out very soon. Just tying up the last bits in the firmware as we speak. And we also released a free device called Pluck, which has gotten a huge amount of downloads, which is really fun. Heard a lot of people making cute carpless strong sounds with that, which is sort of a favorite synthesis method of mine and ours. So yeah, what we're hearing, hopefully subtly in the background, is the devices in our kit collection doing their thing. It sort of started out as this way to visualize things we were doing, like little promo videos and stuff. I made like a little oscilloscope in a Max for Live device, and at some point I was like, well, maybe this could be like an interface, and that kind of spiraled, I would say, into making these collection of little devices that each focus in on a specific thing and do that in a bit abstract way, which is always fun with audio. I feel like sometimes it's nice to have things be a little cryptic, so you're kind of exploring more with your ears rather than eyes or data, which is what all these devices are sort of about, which is why they use little icons and stuff like that instead of little knobs or numbers. Well, besides the huge numbers on jog, which is as a necessity, which I will get into in a moment. So yeah, I think we'll start out with the one thing that makes sound, so we can then use that to try out the other stuff. So I'm just gonna open I'm not gonna open a fresh project at all. I'm just gonna delete tracks. So the first device I'm gonna talk about in this this collection is called Pop, and this is a little, you could say it's an FM synth, which it is, but it kind of does things a little differently. It's about the millionth FM synth I've made at this point. And I'm sure there are a million more to figure out, but this one, what it does differently to a lot of things is that it, instead of going through the ratios and all the harmonics in like a steppy fashion, it like morphs between two oscillators. And if this is sort of a confusing way to put it, think of it kind of like when you use a wavetable synthesizer and go between one waveform to the other. This is sort of doing that, but with FM modulators. So if you just listen to the pure sound, it's obviously just a sine wave. And these little lines are, by the way, just the individual voices and their output. So it's like 6 little oscilloscopes that are just showing whatever is going on in the synthesizer. So yeah, obviously we have a little sine wave going, and all these controls deal with that synthesis engine. And I'll pop out a little info view here, just, for consistency's sake, I guess. But maybe I could even zoom in the interface just a smidge more. There we go. That's nice. So first of all, we have this harmonics control. And this essentially controls the modulation depth, how many harmonics are in the sound. So FM, if you're familiar, the basic concept is you have two sine waves and it modulates the frequency or the phase of the other sine wave, and that sort of creates, you could say, superimposition of the first wave onto the second one, and brings out a bunch of harmonics. That's a very simplistic and a little bit wrong way of putting it, but I think it's also a little easier to understand if you think about it like one high wave modulating a low one, and it kind of brings out harmonics in it. So if we turn it now, we'll just hear that happening. And what's happening when we go above the sort of max, or like the tame levels? Is that it kind of becomes sharper, and this is feedback, which is feeding the modulator back into itself, creating more sharp or aggressive, and at some point it just becomes noise. And this is useful to make timbres that are sharper, obviously, but also just sounds that are quite noisy. And pop responds to velocity input. I'm currently playing it with this Sensal Morph. I think it's called the Sensal with the Buchla Thunder overlay, and I can kind of adjust how much modulation is happening by playing it. And that's always sort of hardwired into the synth. And if you want velocity to always be consistent, you can just pop one of these velocity devices from the MIDI effects and put 127 for both the low and high, and you will always get a consistent timbre regardless of what velocity you play into it. So, and that's another aspect of the devices, is that they sort of try to play into the whole ecosystem of live with all the MIDI effects and all the audio effects, and kind of try to be something that is easy to put in a chain and easy to put in between these different effects and make use of them in ways that are like musically fun or interesting or just useful. So, harmonics. So the next parameter is called spectra, and this controls sort of the overtone pattern, or the modulating oscillator's ratio to the first one, and what that means essentially is that it will create different timbres by changing the parameter. It's, if you're used to a conventional FM synth, this is essentially ratio. But as I mentioned before, instead of stepping through ratios, it morphs between two oscillators, and we can hear that. So this is going to go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 above the principal oscillator, the carrier, and that will happen smoothly. And what's cool with that is we get these in-between timbres that typically would require a little bit more like specific routings to achieve maybe, but this is more of a like almost like a natural control. And someone asked if the harmonics is the only thing that is mapped to velocity. It's a little bit of the harmonic depth and the volume of the note. So it's kind of trying to be sort of like a natural response to the velocity. Yeah. So the spectra simply allows you to scan between these different points of overtones, if you will. And the modulator, or the spectra, has an envelope which will attenuate its depth. And this is useful for making turbo plucks or, you know, any kind of typical FM twang. So we have the control modulator envelope time and the sustain of that. So sustain obviously will control the level where the envelope decays towards. So now we have this dynamic sound that will change over time, controlled by the envelope time. And if you make a really noisy sound, you can almost make like a kind of like a little drum or something like that. The poor drum, but a drum nevertheless. And one cool thing about the envelope is that if you go to its minimum position, being just a super short pluck, you can go backwards, and it will become a sort of fade in, fade out type behavior, or like a slope. So essentially the envelope has these two different modes which you can navigate between fairly easily just by dragging to the top or the bottom ranges. And so that's kind of it for the timbral aspects of it. It's made to be extremely straightforward and simple, and I think that's kind of nice when it comes to FM, because sometimes you just want these classic or simple sounds, just as sometimes you want simple analog sounds or anything really. And at the bottom we have the amp stage with a sort of a traditional ADSR. So that's what these icons are representing. So we have an attack. It goes from short to long, and it controls the fade-in time. And then the decay, that controls the time from the attack stage to the sustain. If you want to have something that's super plucky. The sustain controls the level of that stage. And finally, the release is the final fade out time. that's sort of the main parts of Pluck, pop. And you may have noticed this triangle at the top popping up all the time. And this is a little menu which you can pop out if you press anywhere on the lines. So this is a configuration menu. It allows you to do some pretty funky stuff, like change the tuning for microtonal playing and the series of the spectra modulation. So first, let's talk about the tuning. So I'll try to explain this without getting too deep into music theory, as I'm not an expert myself, but it can get a little overwhelming. So basically, if we look at the piano roll, we have an octave here. So we have 12 notes. So it goes from C to B, and then the next octave starts at the C above. So that's an octave. It's 12 equal divisions. And what you can do with the tuning is a system called Edo, equal divisions of the octave. So instead of dividing the octave into 12 notes, we can divide it into less or more, creating in-betweens. So what that means is it can become microtonal in the sense where you can have further divisions that are sort of off the usual 12-tone equal temperament scale, which is the typical type of tuning system found in like a DAW or most modern synthesizers, although there's starting to popping up more that allow microtonal playing or different tuning systems. So if we increase that to 24, we will have quatertones, and this is sort of a well-known system which adds one step in between each note, so that's kind of easy to grasp in a way. And then we start hearing how it will sound very different. So the beatings are obviously much more intense. It sounds kind of flat. It sounds kind of out of tune, maybe. But as you start to play around with this, you'll be able to find maybe musical flavors that are like kind of more experimental, or even more. I mean, personally, I just like trying out like a new tuning, like 17, and then just kind of playing around with that. And some stuff will sound like a little off, but I just find it super inspiring to try like new tunings and see kind of what comes out and explore that. It's a little less, it's more like a little adventure compared to using something you're very familiar with. And I hope to see more stuff like this going forward in software, because it's after all quite easy to do this actually. It's just the problem is sort of with the piano roll always representing the sort of Western standard 12 tone. And EDO stands for equal divisions of the octave. So what we're doing is dividing an octave, so C to C, into more semitones than 12. So right now we were listening to 17 tones, 17 notes in an octave. So the system is fairly simple to play around with. That's kind of why I went for it. There's other tuning systems like Scala where you can import like a different type of tuning system, but that can get a bit obscure and you have to sort of know a little bit more about what different tuning systems you want to use or whatever. And this is quite easy to just change and get a feel for. Yeah, I mean, obviously not necessarily necessary to use or anything, but it's a fun thing. And that was also another thing with these devices where like we could explore these experimental aspects that might not have fit in a device that is more like maybe not traditional, but more conventional in a way. So that's if anyone has any questions about microtuning and want me to cover it a bit more, let me know, because I know it's an area that can be a bit hard to understand. Someone was asking over Instagram how it works with MIDI and the piano roll, and the answer is it just kind of does. So you can, for example, Jesus, this is so big in Live 11. You can just kind of start out maybe down here. So basically it just kind of works. What you have to do is count a little bit more in your head. So if I would shift this an octave up, it wouldn't be an octave because it's only 12 steps, and this is now divided into 17. So if I shift it up 12, oops, it will sound really out of tune, or like something different basically. So I'd have to go 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. And then I get the same intervals. So basically, it just works with the piano roll as it would MIDI. Fortunately, can't really get any like visuals that represent a 17 EDO tuning, but you can still work with it. So you just have to count a little bit more in your head. And the center note is somewhere, actually. That's a good point. I don't know. It would probably be C60, I guess, in the MIDI note, and then there would be an offset from that. So unfortunately, DAWs are quite tricky when it comes to this stuff. They're not designed to do microtonality at all, which is a shame because I think it's really cool to work with. Even like, you know, even things like if you would have 24 like quarter tones and had that represented in a nice way in the piano roll, it would be really easy to sequence as normal, but you could add like little offsets. Yeah. Any chance of adding MTS ESP? That's the plugin, right? Yeah, I was talking to them, or I was talking to Richard D. James suggested we would add that. He said it was possible with the Max for Live stuff somewhere way back, but I never really looked into it. But maybe. I think it would be cool. It looks quite cool. I think microtonality is something much more worth exploring. Right, so spectra can be changed to different series. So this like default one basically goes between whole numbers. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. And you can change that series if you want something that has a bit more different flavors. So there's one called detune. So each other step is like 1 point something. So it adds like a little detune. Which will create this little beating. There's also halves, which is like we're just doing 0.5 instead of a whole step. Which creates a lot of inharmonicity, which gets really wild when you also have microtonal on, but there's also like a series of only odd ratios, or only even, or sort of a mix. So yeah, there's a few different spectras to explore, giving you different flavors of the synth. And I think there's some areas to explore that's there still. But for now, this is a nice way to start. So let's sequence this. In this kit, we have the sequencer called Jog. If anyone's familiar with the SH101 or the MC202 or the OP1 or any synth that has like these sort of step input sequencers, this does that thing. And it's something I've always wanted to have in live because I really like inputting sequences this way. So essentially what it does is you enter a sequence by playing notes, and each step will be advanced as you're playing the note. I'll just kind of show how that works. I think that's easier than talking about it because it's sounds a little abstract, I notice. So right now it says 0, 1, so that's just the indicator of which step is active, either playing or recording. So when you press the little pen, it will go into recording mode. It starts blinking in red. So now it's waiting for notes. And to enter a note into the sequencer, you simply play it either on a MIDI clip or your keyboard or a MIDI device, anything that's just outputting notes to the channel. And to finish your entering of the sequencer, just press the pen again, and now this sequence will play back when you start the transport in live. So just a super simple way to get a sequence in there. And this takes chords. So yeah. And it also records velocity. But what's really neat about it is that you can change the pattern of the playback. So right now, all of these dots down here represent when a note is going to be triggered or not. And essentially, you can change the density of that. So if you drag the slider, you will see how the density of the dots are lower, the white dots. So each lit or white dot is like a trigger, and a gray or low light one is a rest or not a trigger at all. The limit on notes, the limit on chords, I think are 10 for the fingers. So yeah, so now the pattern has changed for the sequence. Same notes, same everything. So that's like a completely different sequence compared to. And it's different in two ways. It's different like rhythmically, but it's also differently in sort of I don't know what to say, temporal. Because the sort of gaps or whatever is running in its own sequencer lane, separate from the length of the note list. So basically, you can have 11 notes or whatever, and then trigger them in a sequence that is a different meter. So, you know, when we're talking about polymeters and polyrhythms, you will have this kind of evolving nature to it almost. And the density and the sort of pattern of the trigger pattern is a Euclidean algorithm, which tries to distribute the triggers in a sort of geometric fashion. So it's depending on how many steps you have and how dense those are. And to change the amount of steps, you can drag on the dots, and that will change the sequence, the length of the trigger sequence, which can be useful for if you have like maybe just 3 notes in there. You might want something that's a length of 4, so you get this, as I said, this sort of polymetric relationship. So it just makes your sequences a bit more dynamic. And what's cool about it is that you can this can be changed in real time or at any point changed without being destructive. You can always go back to a point, whether or not it doesn't actually change the sequence itself. It just changes how it's being played back. So this is something that can be played around with live or just changed to however you feel like it without ruining anything. And the little arrow at the top when you're recording is a note rest, which makes a gap. So if you play that back with a filled pattern, obviously the rhythm we entered is the one we hear, but then again we can change that with the and you can get really interesting unexpected results by messing around with this. the other controls are this arrow here. It controls if it's going, the sequencer is going forward, or if it's doing a ping pong motion, meaning when it reaches the end, it goes back and then back again. And this little decay-ish looking thing is the note length. Yeah, and this last control here is just simply the clock division of the sequencer, meaning it can run half as fast as the main transport BPM. Yeah, and so one thing that's pretty cool about Jog, or another thing that's pretty cool, is that you can actually stack them. So I can put one before the other. So, and what that allows me to do is use this function, this little arrow right here. When it's has this dot and goes up, it means that the sequencer is in transport mode. So if I start playing this and then enter a MIDI note, I can transpose the sequence. And this can sort of be automated. So if I have, let's just try and play like a more sensible. So this can be automated. Let's see where the root. You can use another jog to sequence the transposition. So first I can play it with a MIDI note when the sequencer is stopped, to kind of find the different, the root note, which is this one. So maybe I wanted to transpose it by 7 semitones. Then I can enter that in the first one here. So if I run these at the same time now, this first one will transpose the second one. So yeah, and they're obviously running at different meters, which is creating like kind of a different sequence that evolves a little over time, depending on where it lines up and stuff like that. So if I pull this to something a bit more unexpected. So obviously this can be used to make quite complex sequences by transposing the first one with the second, and then having them run at different rhythms and different amounts of steps and have that interact. And it's akin to the concept of our sequencer roulette, but in a more modular fashion. And you can stack as many of these as you want to make really complex stuff. And when you do that, I really recommend having a scale a scale device in between. We could do it with like some sort of like minor pentatonic might be nice. So now I can like have another one and just kind of bang on the MIDI, and it will always stay in key. So yeah, that's jog. It can be used to make these funky, almost algorithmic sequences, and it can be really easy or really hard depending on what you want to achieve. But if you just pop a scale device in between, it's pretty easy. And yeah, and to reset these little numbers, you can just click on them and it will be non-transposed. The other mode of the little transposition arrow is through, which will just push any notes through, and this can be used to make like chord sequencing. So now instead we have sequencing two voices at once with two jogs. So it can be used either to transpose another jog or to layer them for chords or polyphonic sequencing. So yeah. Random playback. Perhaps that would be interesting. It's something I promised someone to look into at some point. So whenever we're doing some update to Kit, which I think will happen eventually, I'm definitely going to look into random, because it's obviously one of those features that people really like to just get in there. The next device, I'm just going to keep building this chain. The next device in this series is called U, and this is a filter, and it's a so-called bass width filter, or a type of band pass. And for those of you who are fans of the early Electron devices, such as the mono machine or the machine drum, will recognize this filter. It's very much inspired by how the filter on those devices work. And what it does is that it is very much like a bandpass, but you have a bass frequency and then a width which controls sort of the circumference of the bandpass. So you can get really narrow points and move around in the frequency range where that little band is audible, or you can get very wide and just change either the high pass or the low pass. So it's essentially like a high pass, low pass, but they're tied together. And the controls work where in a way where these top two dots control the peak of each filter, the Q factor, or resonance, and the bottom ones control the cutoff. But how the cutoff works is that, as I said, it's called bass and width. So the width is the kind of low pass part of it, where it controls much like a low pass filter. And the bass is much like a high pass. But if you change the width to a lower value and change the bass, the width will follow, sort of creating this narrowness across the spectra. So you get this kind of uniform bandpass filter that you can use to pick out certain parts of a sound or just do whatever you feel like filtering wise. So yeah, it can be used as like a very standard low pass, but also as this variable bandpass sort of thing. And the Q factor, the resonance, actually gain compensates. So if you have this at a very high level, it will try and push the volume down so it doesn't clip. And this is sort of to make it more usable for running a loop through it or something like that. Like without that, this would clip a lot. So it's just this one of those things that just make it a little easier to use without having to constantly dial back the volume or stuff like that. And one thing I really wanted to do with a filter in live was to have it sort of triggerable by the sequencer or something like that. And Effect Tracks doesn't really allow MIDI in live, so without some workarounds that are a little awkward. So I decided to make a sort of pattern sequencer similar to the one found in Jog. So these controls all relate to that. So this is when you press play, you see that these little dots will animate, showing the current sequence position. And these are actually triggers for the envelope, and that's the controls above them. That's a little attack decay or slope envelope, much like the one found on Pop. So this controls the depth of that. So if I start messing around with that when it's playing, you will see how it's starting to modulate the cutoff of the width part of the filter. And this has the same Euclidean type fill of the pattern as Jog. Which is also something you can mess around with live. And the envelopes of U works much like Pop, where you can drag it backwards and it will go into the slope. And of course, the same thing is available for the bass side. So you have this envelope control of both filters. So U is just this nice tool to be able to introduce like different rhythms and stuff. It's really nice with like drum rhythms or samples where you want to have like filterings that are very rhythmical, and you can do stuff that is like a bit more dynamic. And just an overall quite nice sounding high pole. I think it's a 48 dB filter, which will really roll off frequencies quite steeply. And the last device in the kit collection is called Box, and this is a reverb with a lot of tone, whatever that means. Let's just pop that in there and see what it sounds like. So yeah, obviously it's a huge reverb. It's supposed to be this very synthy reverb that got very popular in the 90s, which I personally love, like the old school like Warp record stuff. Um, and it has some pretty cool features such as distortion and pretty strange but very musical filter that can really change the tonality and make it quite harsh, or whatever flavor fits your bill. And the feedback in it can be used to self-oscillate, so it can get quite wild. And the first control always is dry wet, so this is sort of representing the different signals. First we have the input, and as I drag it into a higher value, it will go into the reverb part. So yeah, just simple dry wet. And the next parameter is the size of the reverb, or the size of the space, or yeah, and yeah, it basically makes it sort of the larger or smaller space, but also kind of affects the secondary reflection part. We'll get into a little in a little bit. And it can get extremely long. So yeah, if you push it really into the max, you'll just get this sustained, huge reverb sound, which I think is really useful a lot of times, where you just want to completely wash away all the transients and everything and just make like a completely new sound, sort of. And the next parameter is feedback, and this will sort of also control length. So if you think about size as like the space, you can think about feedback as the time of the the reverb ringing out in the space, which is like physically always connected. But since we're dealing with algorithms, we can just make these things up. So obviously now with no feedback, it's a very short reverb tail. But as I start to increase that, we'll hear more and more decaying reverb tones. And as I said before, the feedback can self-oscillate. So if you push it up to the max while it's playing, and this can obviously be used as a really neat musical effect. It can be tuned to whatever you're playing by adjusting the size. So the feedback will sort of ring out in different frequencies depending on the size of the space, and you can sort of tune that by ear a little bit. Right now I seem to have lucked out, and it kind of just sounds good with this. And as it starts feedbacking and ringing out a lot, it also kind of distorts a little bit within the reverb to kind of make it a little more natural sounding, much like a guitar amp would behave when you feed that back. So just to make it sort of not super harshly digital, but kind of still within the realm of DSP stuff. The next parameter is a little LFO that makes sort of things a little wobbly. It's kind of chorus-like depending on how you set things up. It's introducing sort of the wobble and warble into the reverb tail, and it will make things sound a little more lively, if you will. At max, it will just be kind of completely out there in terms of like going completely tuning things up and down really dramatically, but just a little bit, it can be quite. And it will also affect how the feedback works. Since when the modulation is much deeper on the LFO, and it just affects the sort of pitch of the reverb with this like chorusing thing, feedback will naturally run through that, and it will become more noisy rather than a sustained tone. So if we listen to that compared to without the max modulation, it's ringing out into sort of almost an oscillation, a tone. But if we increase that to max, it'll be more like a noise almost, which is just because of the pitch changing so dramatically, so fast. And Box has two sides to it, which is the like space aspect of the reverb and the reflection. And that's just made up terms by me, but what I sort of mean by that is like this box right here controls the sort of vastness of the reverb, and this part right here controls sort of the more closer reflections of you, if you will, of like a percussive sound or something like that, and that can be changed to something super short, and you will more noticeably hear like plucks and stuff. Which is like useful for drums or stuff like that. And this parameter right next to the size of the reflection controls the balance between the reflection part and the space part. And the reflection sort of has a lot fewer reverb cores, you could say, which makes it sound a little less smooth, but that's better for impulses because it makes them kind of blast through a bit more. But you can also push that into an extreme setting, and then you get these kind of almost like grainy little repetitions that some of you might know from like our chiral devices reverb, where you can push it really far and you get kind of almost little shards of sound. So yeah, obviously it can be used to a very unconventional reverb where it can be used almost more to shape the sound rather than put it in a space. And the two different sides of that can be used a lot to change whether, like right now we have it configured with this like kind of the grainy, almost echo-like reverberations balanced with the big space, but we can do mostly big space and just a little bit of echoes. And you just kind of get a hint of that, or the other way around. Creating almost two completely separate sounds, which I think is really cool. The reverb has a built-in filter to make it sound kind of brighter or darker. So when that's activated, the sort of tail of the reverb gets more like high frequency content or more low frequency content. Just another thing to further sculpt the sound and kind of try and tune the reverb to where you need it to be, depending on what kind of stuff you have going through it. And where things can get really interesting tonally is this last part where we have a distortion effect built into a few different points of the reverb, where it's mixing things together and distorting it, it's doing filters and all kind of things, and I think it sounds quite special. So yeah, again, this is made to sound more like something that would come out of a guitar amp or like a shoegaze track or something like that. So it has a lot of like filtering and sort of layering going on in the distortions. It sort of sounds not just like having a distortion device after it, but more as a part of the whole effect. And one of the presets I think shows this off really nicely, like the crunchy one where it's using So yeah, it can get really aggressive or kind of subtle distortion, but it's a reverb that really doesn't try to be very conventional, but goes more for sculpting a sound rather than putting it into a space. So yeah, that's kind of the kit, all of the devices, and together you can chain them in all these like interesting ways to form different little behaviors almost, and that's kind of what the different presets try to do. So we have things like this kind of drums that is trying to use just the devices in a group to form like a little drum patch. Or something like the soft chords, where it's making more something a little traditional. And I try to sort of think of these devices as almost creating like a small groove box inside of Live. And I really encourage using them in different orders and constellations. Let's see if one has like, no, but this might be a good. So obviously like the reverb is typically last, but you can also put the filter at the end and have like a processing of the space with this like rhythmic filter aspect. Maybe not the best example, but it's really interesting to change orders and see what happens, and kind of also try different lanes of devices. Like here I've got two chains of different devices in an instrument rack being sequenced by two jogs. So there's like one bass part. And then one top part. So it's just trying to use the built-in sort of device flow of Live to make interesting things. And here's one with four reverbs and a filter that's being pinged by just a short impulse of pop. So yeah, it's very much a playground where connecting different devices in different orders can have very different results. And we really want people to explore not so much with their eyes, but more with their ears, which is why the devices have these semi-cryptic interfaces. Because sometimes I feel like when using things like these, let's look at this 19 Edo tune. When using things like these that have more representations of sound and parameters and synthesis, you can sort of more become lost in the sound rather than numbers. When you look at other things, at least for myself, I find myself looking almost too much at like what's the number of this dial, or what's the cutoff frequency of this. And sometimes it's nice to just turn something that just looks like a little icon and use your ears to see where that lands and tune it to what you're hearing rather than what you're seeing. It can be quite meditative in a way. So yeah, if there are any questions about all of this, now is the time. All of the parameters are modulatable and automatable, so you could use, is it an audio effect, the LFO? Yes, so you can use the built-in LFO of Live to map that to something like the harmonics of the pop. And if you open the automation view, no, that one, you will see all the different parameters available for automation and modulation and everything. So yeah, it's all there. Which preset do I use on the Thunder layout for the Sensal Morph? This thing again. I think I made my own at some point, or maybe I can't ever tell. It's very hard to tell what mode it is in. I think it's some notes I just whacked in there and thought they sounded nice. I find it very hard to map, actually, to get something that's like, that's cool. Quarter tones, what could this be? Nice. yeah, these are all of our devices in the kit collection of devices from us. Pluck, yes, why not? Yeah, we released this free device called Pluck. That's kind of very simple but charming. Sorry, just looking up where I put this. Pluck. How many notes can you type into jog? I believe it's 64, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So 64, but then it's also polyphonic, and yeah. So Pluck is a it's a little low. It's basically a little carpless strong synth, and for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a very classic like digital synthesis algorithm where you have a delay that's tuned to a certain frequency and it's feedbacked into itself, so it creates kind of a tone when you strike it with an impulse or a noise source or something like that. Kind of goofy, kind of cute. I really like how carpless strong stuff sounds. Just a quick run through. This thing controls sort of the timbral aspects from striking at the very edge of the string, or I don't think that's how it works physically. It was like very narrow impulse, making like a pulse-ish sound, to a thick one, making more like a square. And if you go push it downwards, it will add noise and some sharper edges to the impulse. So from very soft to a little harder. And you can change the decay rate, making it sustain much longer. To just super short. And damp kind of controls the frequency fall off over time. So if you have that very low, it would just make these snappy. And at maximum, you'll ring out for a very long time and have a lot of frequency content still there. And it kind of has a very special thing where it triggers actually a little sine wave almost, or triangle wave into the voice, which is why it can make these very mellow sounds that are not so common with these type of carpless strong instruments. And it has 6 voices. Because I thought it would be funny. It was a 6-string instrument, like a little joke almost. So that's Pluck. Yeah, and with that, I think we're done. Well, I'm glad you would have paid for it, but we're happy to give it away. Yeah, thanks everyone for showing up and looking at our stuff, and yeah, very excited to share what's coming up. We got some really cool projects going, and some big ones. And what's next, I'm gonna keep it a secret. And no sneak peeks for now. It might take a little while, but I'm very excited about it. It's been something that's that has been on the radar for a while, but it's taken quite a while before we've taken the plunge to actually do it. So yeah, that's the future. I did not talk about Osiris that much, besides just mentioning that it happened. So Osiris is a UREC module we developed for Modbap Modular, or at least the synth part of it we developed for Modbap Modular. And it's a wavetable oscillator. I would really recommend checking it out. It's going to be released any minute now. Yeah, Modbap Modular. So it's up on their website, I think. So yeah, thanks for checking in, and I hope we all learned something today. And take care, and see you the next stream.